Greetings, everyone. Today we're diving into the topic of Python functions, an essential concept for an aspiring programmer. Functions in Python are reusable blocks of code, capable of performing specific tasks. They can take inputs, provide outputs, or both. Let's delve deeper into their functionality. Parameters are variables passed into a function, while returns are the values the function sends back after execution. Think of it like a wood chipper. The wood would be a parameter that goes into the function being the wood chipper itself, and then the wood chips being the return value, what comes out of the function. However, not all functions require parameters or return values. Consider a light switch. Flipping it triggers an action without needing any input or producing any output. There's just an action always happening, but nothing needs to go into a light switch, and a light switch is not returning anything. In summary, functions in Python are reusable blocks of code that may or may not take input or provide a return value. However, they will always conduct an action, serving as powerful tools for organizing and simplifying your code. Now let's take a look at some actual practical application here. Here in our 1.5 script, we have our function calls. These examples in your script will already be filled out, but let's take a look at how this should function. Now, when we go into defining a function, it is established by the def keyword. We're going to go ahead and utilize def to say, hey, we are defining a function. This function will now be a variable that I can call later on. And we can see how a function is called down below. We call the name of the function, and utilizing an opening and closing parentheses, we trigger set of function. So let's see, def greet. This should just return some sort of greeting. I'm going to go ahead and say print hello all. Well, now when I execute this script, this greet is going to be called. It's going to trigger this function, and this action of print hello all will show up on my terminal. So let me go ahead and change directory into 1-intro. I'm going to utilize Python 3 to execute the script 1.5-functions.py. And here we can see hello all. This sum is from a function down below. If we scroll down, here's another print statement. Currently it's returning none, and we'll go into why that's returning none. All right. So just like we established earlier, a function may take an input and may provide an output. Although this function is printing something, it is not providing an output. Now, here's what I mean by that. If I were to use variable reassignment, and I say, I call this my greeting result. Now make that equal to the function greet. Well, let's go ahead and print my greeting result. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to comment this line of code so that we don't see another print statement down below. You can see that a comment was created by adding that pound sign at the beginning of the string, or excuse me, at the beginning of that line of code. Now let's go ahead and execute our code one more time by running Python 3 1.5-functions.py. When I get two print statements, one of them being from hello all, that's happening inside of my function, and an action is being triggered. But my function isn't returning a value. As you can see here, in my greeting result, I am assigning it to the return of my greet function. And when I go to print it, it doesn't show me anything. It says, hey, this function returned nothing. There is nothing that is being returned by this function. Well, what's the difference? If I'm just seeing something on my terminal show up, isn't it actually, in fact, returning something or showing me something? Well, the key difference is that when this is done being executed, meaning the function is completed, it is not giving back a value that I could assign to a variable. That's what we mean by return. So let's take a look at this. What happens if I take this print statement and I exchange it for the keyword of return? Well, now this function is going to return a string. That string will be assigned to my greetings result variable, and my print statement will then print out my return value from my greet function. Well, let's execute it again. We're going to run Python 3 1.5 dash functions.py. And now we can see hello all showing up on my terminal. Fantastic. Let's move on to our next exercise. So here we have a function that can actually utilize a parameter. And it's utilizing a greet a person parameter. And we can see here that we have an example like welcome Alice. Well, what would that look like? I'm going to go ahead and have this function return, because I want my function to return something. I want it to return hello, comma, and we're going to place, before we get into string interpolation, I'm just going to do comma space plus name. And then we can see that it's this program is already trying to help me. It's trying to complete my code for me, which is perfectly fine to get a couple of hints here and there. So now it tells me this is what we need. We're going to return. We have some string. We're going to add the parameter that's being passed into us as string. And then we're going to end by adding another portion of string. Right? We're just putting words together, essentially. Well, now let's call this function. Let's say we want to have a variable called, let's call this Francisco's greeting. And let's make this the greet person function. We're going to call this function and pass in the name Francisco. Awesome. Let's see what happens when we print Francisco's greeting. You'll notice that even though Replit is suggesting the correct answer for me, I'm still typing it out. It's extremely important that you actually get the practical application of writing things out. It may be tempting to just press tab to autocomplete every single time, especially when we're starting off. We want to make sure we create that muscle memory by physically typing every single character on the keyboard. Well, now I'm going to run Python 3 1.5 dash functions.py. We see the original hello all from my print statement up above on line 14. And now we see hello Francisco. My function takes in a parameter, just like our example of the wood chipper, where instead of a wood, it's taken in string. And then it's returning a sentence or some sort of greeting for one specific person. Francisco now turns into the variable of name, and it gets added here. So we get hello Francisco as our final output from our function. Awesome. Let's move into our next example. In our next example, we have add numbers. So for add numbers, we're just simply going to return the added value of A and B. So let's take a look at that. We're going to return A plus B. That's our entire function there. I'm going to uncomment line 48, which will then bring back the sum add numbers. And if I were to execute my script utilizing 1.3, 1.5 dash functions.py, we could see the sum is 8. My add numbers function has 5 and 3. 5 represents the letter A, 3 represents the letter B. 5 plus 3 is equal to 8, and that's why I get that in my final print statement. All right, now let's talk about default values for parameters. Earlier, we have a greet a person function, And this had the function of name. Well, if we were to call this function without a value, you'll see that it'll actually throw an error. Let's try to execute this. It tells me, hey, you try to run a function, but we're missing a positional argument. This function is meant to have one argument, and you cannot call it without said argument. Okay, perfectly fine. Let me execute my script again. Everything's working one more time. Well, now, if we scroll down to this greet with default value, we can see that there is an assignment operator happening within my function parameter. Well, the function greet with default still takes in a parameter of name, but in case I don't pass in a parameter or a name, in this case, it will always default to guest. Let's take a look at that. In this case, I'm just going to print hello again plus name plus exclamation point. All right, this function is not returning a value. It is simply going to print something into my terminal. And you can see that in one of these function calls, it does not have a parameter that's being passed in. And in another of these function calls, it does have a parameter that's being passed in. Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to run Python 3, 1.5, functions.py. Well, here we see hello guest, and here we see hello Alice. Well, what happened? When we didn't pass in a parameter, it defaulted to the value of guest, and that's why we see hello guest. When we did pass in a parameter, it said, well, guest is the default value, but because I am getting a parameter, I'm going to override guest and replace it with Alice. And that is it for functions. Thank you so much, everyone. Here's a stretch exercise, and there's also exercises for each one of the function practices that we implemented today. So please go ahead and complete this script before moving on into the next lesson. Thank you so much, everyone.